So we talked a little bit about the title story. It starts off with the double punch of the narrator's sister is 2 weeks late, like pregnancy wise, right? On the 3 year anniversary of their mother's death. Am I getting that right?
Yeah.
And the narrator at one time left art school, disappointed mom again. We talked about the green frog. Sorry, tell me the Korean term again.
청개구리.
Is what the narrator definitely, is. You said your mom kind of said it jokingly. This mom, not so much. Um, the father was, well, the mother who had passed away, like we said, 3 years before. The dad wants to pray on this special day. Um, and it just talks about kind of this some of the foibles, if you will, of the family. They have, I believe, like a kind of a store,
Yeah, they run a restaurant.
a restaurant, excuse me, right? And so the narrator, just kind of the classic like art school and kind of trying to do her own thing, being more on the creative side, while her sister's been the one who's really kind of gone the more conventional route, that, university and such. And there's just something the last scene is so satisfying is underplaying it, but it's such a satisfying meal they have. It's kind of a kind of a motley crew of people who are there, right? It's the woman who brings the meal, never seems to look them in the eye and just kind of say, "Here, you need this, right?" You
Yeah.
know, especially to like the bachelor, right? The father who's doesn't have his wife anymore around. And there's a beautiful line that was said earlier in the book. It was something that was to reassure the narrator, and when she was a kid, and the mother had just said to her simply something like, "I am here, you are here." You are here, I am here. And
Mhm.
again, in this kind of rendered community, this community that they make in the end, it doesn't solve everything. It doesn't solve all the heartache and the traumas, but it's just a beautiful sense of community. And it ends with "I am here, you are here," if not the exact last line. What's here? What's the here you're referring to? What's ideas of community there in that story where again it's not a traditional nuclear family, so to speak, but it's a beautiful, coming together.
Oh, that's such a good question. I think, um, yeah, when the narrator is recalling sort of her early experiences as a child, especially with like anxiety and feeling kind of
Hmm.
outside of her body,
Right.
her mother does this thing where she like kind of physically grounds her by saying like, "I'm here, you're here." She doesn't say this in the story, but it's implied, um, that she can be there and be a sort of container for her child's anxieties by reminding
Hmm.
her like, hey, we're okay, we're here, we're safe. And then of course after her mother passes, she doesn't really have anyone in her life who can do that for her. And even though, as you mentioned, the character has like sort of disappointed her mother, or she feels she's disappointed in her mother in not sort of achieving kind of standard things like finishing school, getting a great job and all. It's implied that her mother really kind of understood her on that level and in a way that no one else in her
Hmm.
life did. And so it's a huge, huge loss for her in many ways. And in that last scene where she's just kind of having dinner with her sister, with her father, with Mrs. Pak, who's like kind of
Right.
the busybody community member who's like dropping off food and is kind of annoying, but is also
Hmm.
like really thoughtful. And they're also eating with like their staff at the restaurant. I wanted her to sort of be able to give that kind of moment of grounding to herself, where she reminds herself, like, oh, I am here. I didn't, die along with my mother. I am still living and here, and it's my responsibility to do with that what only I can do. Where she spends so much of of her the last few years at the point that we meet her in the story, grieving and sort of feeling really stuck because she feels like in a lot of ways really responsible for her mother's death. She feels responsible for the fact that she didn't live up to her sister's example. And then it's only in that final scene that she's able to actually stop beating herself up for once and realize that, hey, actually, like I still have a life to live, and I'm here. What am I going to do about it? Is kind of the note that the reader that I wanted to leave the reader with when we leave her at that point in the story. And yeah, I think in terms of endings, I'm someone who doesn't mind when something isn't totally resolved at the end of a story because
Yes.
especially with a short story, we're seeing someone usually for, just a couple of moments or even just one
Mhm.
moment in their life. And for me, I don't need a character to have done a complete 180 by the end of it, but I do want to know, if we see them facing a decision or trying to figure out where they're going to go next, I do want to know that they are oriented either towards making that decision or, alternatively making a different kind of decision. Or in some cases, um, to not make the decision is a decision in itself as well. And that's
Mhm.
something that I also try to explore in other stories in the collection as well.
Definitely. There's that vein of community running through the collection, not necessarily in a positive way with the story. The Fruits of Sin. This was Sora. She's a 17-year-old who is pregnant. She's the daughter of the pastor, right?
Hmm.
And there's the got the gossips in the at the church, talking their mess about everybody and kind of, oh my gosh, I'm glad that's not my daughter, glad it's not my granddaughter. Um, but at the same time, there's also a beauty without ruining the end of that story, but the whole female congregation is almost by the end is as if they are all kin, they're all family to Sora. And there's a line towards the end, something about we were ready. We,
Mm.
right, for this where that could be so lonely for that girl to be giving birth at 17. With definitely a complicated, convoluted father situation to say the least, meaning the father of the baby, and
Hmm.
just we were ready. Um, Speaking of the ideas of church and belief, there's the narrator who at the very least would be agnostic and the most would be atheist, and just her belief was in Stacy Shin,
Mm,
right? I
hmm.
think the story is actually called Stacy Shin or something.
I think it's the Names for Fireflies that you're
So not,
referring
so not even
to.
close. Sorry. Okay.
It starts off with Stacy, so you
Yes.
weren't far off.
Exactly. But just this idea that belief. We talk about the women at church, and you can talk about if that's living out, their beliefs and being gossipy, but it's definitely living out their beliefs and in being welcoming in the end to Sora. There's so much about loss in this. Rabbit Heart is one of my favorite stories. There's this beautiful relationship with the grandmother in Soul,
Hmm.
and there's also ideas of just what might have been. And
Yeah.
she helps her rabbit granddaughter be beautiful. What's the meaning of rabbit, I guess, in that story?
Yeah, so rabbits are a figure that like appear a lot in Korean folklore,
Hmm.
and they're usually associated. I mean, rabbits themselves just universally are such a like a fascinating like creature in terms of like the symbolism of them. I
Mm.
mean, of course, they mean different things across different cultures, but in Korean folktales, they're often seen as these sort of like trickster figures,
Mm.
where there's a lot of stories where the rabbit is like, is in a sticky situation that managed to get out through their wiles because they're,
Mm.
they're fleet of foot and they're very quick. It's also said this is I think true across a lot of East Asian um folkloric traditions that in the moon there are two rabbits that are like pounding rice cakes. And
Mm.
that's just said because of the shape of the shadows on the moon.
Mm.
And I always liked that idea that it was kind
Mm.
of it just feels like it feels more exciting and more cute than a man in the moon. I'm like, what is the man in the moon doing? But if
Yeah,
it's two rabbits, they're making
there you go.
snacks or something.
Sure.
So in that story, the rabbit is a figure that, the grandmother kind of tells the granddaughter in that story, like, oh, you have the heart of a rabbit, like you're so scared, you're so
Mm.
timid. But also the rabbit is a figure of resourcefulness and
Hmm.
creativity and cleverness, as I said. And so in that story, without spoiling it too much for folks who haven't read it yet, I wanted to create an ending for the grandmother and the granddaughter that you normally wouldn't be able to see in a sort of quote unquote more realistic sense. It's definitely one of the more fantastical
Sure.
stories in the collection. So I just liked this idea of like, a character that has grown up hearing these stories and, might get a little opportunity to sort of write a different ending for herself and for of her beloved
Mm.
grandmother.
There's so much about memory. One of the lines, I believe it's from the reattachment, maybe not, but it's pain isn't always bad. It's there because it wants us to tell us something.
Mm,
And I don't think it's from this, or I actually don't think it matters. That's one of those that's very universal, right? There's so much in this collection about having to go through pain, like you said, going through it rather than around it, avoiding it. Leo and I don't know if you pronounce it as Gnos or Nos,
Oh,
the
in my
company.
head, it's Nos.
Nos, okay.
Yeah.
And this idea that he has this invention, the narrator has just been fired by her husband, who becomes her ex-husband. Basically, this idea that sorry, Nos, he said.
Yeah,
Nos,
Nos.
this idea of dumping memories. There's this presence that follows Amy. That's the woman's name. And this idea that you can dump memories, that you can, upload them to the cloud, that you can really untangle yourself from these traumas, from these memories. I'm reminded of Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I thought you had such a cool play on it. Just this idea when I think of uploading, I'm thinking of like as a positive thing. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
want to upload memories and but it's like just get up there, get rid of them. I wonder what you're kind of investigating there with ideas of memory and what we remember, what we choose to remember, how we choose to remember.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and I love Eternal Sunshine, so I'm glad you brought it up. It wasn't until I was like, I think kind of done with initial versions of that story where I was like, oh, I kind of see some of the Eternal Sunshine ideas, some of
Yeah,
the ideas that get explored in that movie in the story as well, but through a bit of a different lens. But
they are.
in thinking about the invention that is discovered and sort of like becomes this very lucrative thing in that story, I was thinking about how, I mean, who among us hasn't like experienced something painful, or even if it's just something embarrassing, like,
Mm.
you know, and then just think to yourself like, oh, I wish I could just forget about that or control Z it, and just get
Mhm.
rid of it from the brain.
Controls it, yeah.
Yeah, but of course, with what we know today about the way trauma is stored in the body, it's not as simple as just forgetting it. There are instances where people do forget what has happened to them, maybe when they were a little, maybe something happened when they were kids or
Mm.
whatever. But then, you might have like a lingering sort of reaction to a given
Mhm.
stimulus or a given like place or something like that. I
Mhm.
mean, it's gotten to the point where when it's depicted in like contemporary films or TVs, like it's almost like a trope where it's like you might have a character that has a negative reaction to like birthday clowns, and then it's revealed
Sure.
that something traumatic happened with a clown. But
Mhm.
I do think that it's true in how it manifests in how we experience the past and the present. And in a lot of ways, the body does not always know what time it is. The body is always going to, part of the body is always going to be living in whatever traumatic moment that was, if it's not
Mm.
resolved and fully lived in the body or processed in some way. So with that story, I was really interested in what a world in which people could upload their most traumatic memories to the cloud, what that kind of world would look like. And I do think that if something like this were to be developed, it would be incredibly successful. Like
Mm.
we live in a culture and in a society, especially here in the United States, where so many people just, I mean, even just coming out of this period of the pandemic that we've been in, there's so many people are just so eager to get back to normal,
Yeah.
right? And I
Yeah.
understand it. I get it. It's
Mm.
it's very uncomfortable to sit in pain and shame or trauma or loss, but if we don't sit with it, then we're never really actually going to learn from any of it. And
Mm.
you know, to the point about Eternal Sunshine, that movie is all about recurrence and how we are sort of quote unquote doomed or fated, if you will, to
Mm.
repeat the things that we don't ever really learn from.
Mm.
And I think to an extent that's really true. And with Amy's story in that one, I wanted to sort of examine what the costs of that would look like, both physically and in a more metaphysical sense, and that she's
Mm.
sort of followed by this shadowy presence that she doesn't really understand and
Mm.
doesn't know how to get rid of, quote unquote, until she realizes what it actually means to her.
And a lighter note, you mentioned the birthday clowns. I'm scared. I've always been scared of everything, but I was never scared of those as kids. As a kid, I didn't understand. And then I got older. I'm like, oh, okay, I see it now. I see it. The
Yeah,
makeup's running, you know what I mean? It's just,
it's scary. I mean, yeah, I didn't grow up like watching it because I think I was like too young when
oh,
it came out, but
yeah.
then I think it speaks to it is just one of the like many manifestations of how scary like a clown can be. It's because you can't see the face, right? It's a very
Yes.
primal fear. We don't
Yes,
know
yes,
who it
yes.
is underneath the mask and
Hmm.
the makeup.
Hmm. No doubt about it. More about technology and memory with I don't know, again, the company Lapsi, maybe Lapsi.
Hmm.
And the story's called Reattachment. and Ellie or Eleanor had died at age 5. No, excuse me, had died at like 16.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this idea that you can, like a doll, like a robot, but like human in human form, really, that you can have this reattachment. You can buy this the new Ellie, the one who died at 16. That story is oh my gosh, that story is so just on a craft level is incredibly well done. It's incredibly profound, incredibly tear-jerking. But this idea that the parents who lost her at 16, they chose to get her back at age 5.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This idea of fixed memories and when she was, I don't know, not at her best, but when she was young and innocent, I get, I guess some of the ideas there. But there's also a lot about guilt, where the mother, the one telling the story, about phone calls not answered or phone calls not returned, something that wouldn't have necessarily saved her daughter's life, but there's just so much there. And when they're trying to learn to know or love this robot child, it's incredibly moving. And I don't really know, I have a question there. I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think that story too came out of another kind of thought experiment I had with myself where I was like, in this life, like so many of us do go through bereavement. What would it be like to bring back a version of the person that we've lost? And what if you had the choice to bring them back, maybe at an age or a time of life where they were easier to deal with, a little bit easier to love? And I mean, and the mother in that story loves her daughter deeply and really blames herself in a lot of ways, perhaps, quite unfairly for her daughter's death. And I think she does that not because she logically thinks she could have done anything, but um, there's this idea that's if something is your fault, then maybe you could have done something to change it. And that to her is more acceptable than the idea that, there was nothing she could have done to help.
Interesting. That's
Yeah,
a play
yeah.
kind of on the that's a play on the usual, I think.
Mm.
This idea that it almost makes you feel better that you could have done something. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, I think what we're saying is like, yeah, it's this idea that like if something is my fault, like let's say, someone is like rude.
It's not unexplainable. It's not, right?
Yeah, it's easier to believe, I think, in some cases that something is your fault than that it was just the universe being random or cruel, or
Yeah.
that this person was always fated to die in like a
Right.
horrible way or something like
Right.
that. Like if you feel like you are blaming, if you feel like you can blame yourself for something, then it's actually a way of like it's the brain's way of trying to maintain control over a situation
Mm,
where actually you fundamentally had no control at
sure. Sure.
all.
Yeah.
And I think the choice to, quote unquote, bring her daughter back in this AI form is another way of trying to assert control over this situation that she has no control over. And in the story, she and her husband kind of tell herself, like, oh, it's to process the grief. We never really got
Mhm.
to process it because of how sudden the death was. But I think the story is all about, as you said, guilt, loss, and ultimately dealing with the fact that like we have no control over certainly the well-being of like the people in our lives, but also we have no control over like who our loved ones might become. And
Mm.
um in the story, Ellie, the daughter, when she becomes a teenager, her relationship with her mother, which, previously was very loving, very supportive, very harmonious, becomes this like, typical
Mhm.
parent teenager relationship full of animosity and conflict and things. And the mother, instead of, trying to ride out those waves, thinks to herself, like, I must have done something wrong in order
Mm.
to be here. And that's kind of the mentality behind why she chooses what she does in the story.
I know from personal experience and from reading and what I've heard, it does seem there's definitely something to this idea that when someone passes you, it takes a while, but after a while you start to think of them in at 18 or 24 or 33. For whatever reason, you fixate on them, and not maybe at the age that they passed away, not the age that they died, but at a certain age. And there's something so heartbreaking about, was it Amma? How would you pronounce that? AMMA? Is the stress on the end, or like for mother?
Oh, it's Omma.
Oma.
Yeah, the stress is on the first syllable.
Okay. And just the way that she was programmed to say those things that the parents would remember. And obviously it's not her, but
Hmm.
it's another version of her. there's so much also about expectations, and this is pretty obvious, but complicated relationships with parents, to say the least. There's the woman, it's the story of the arrow, and the
Mm,
narrator is pregnant, and she's not sure which guy it is, and her mother in the end ends up coming to clean and visit, and just different ways of showing love. Her mom's not going to say I love you, but they definitely had a rocky, turbulent relationship, to say the least. And her mom is just there. There's some sort of detente. I don't know if that's the word, right? There's a pause in the fighting, which hopefully will become a permanent, ceasefire. But it's a situation where, sorry, I hate these war references. But it's just the same as that one story we talked about too, where they have that community that comes together in the restaurant, and it's
hmm
a small moment of relief in, what could be a lot of trouble to come. The last story, where the daughter comes to get her father's stuff. Her father had died in Austin, Texas. He was a professor working with bats, and she writes about she's not sure where his anger stopped and hers began.
hmm
And this idea that oftentimes we're like our parents, even if we don't want to be, right? And
Yeah.
definitely a lot about parents as contradictions. This father, there were some beautiful moments in there of looking back, flashbacks of the father. He sang to her in the cave when they got separated, when they were investigating the bats. He went down on his knees and was praying and crying when he found her, when she was lost for just a split moment. But he was also abusive. He was also physically, sounds like, at least on one occasion, he was mentally abusive. Parents as contradictions. Am I oversimplifying that?
No, I think you're exactly right that a lot of the parents and depictions of parenthood in the story collection are pretty complicated. I am not a parent, but I feel a sort of growing interest as a writer in what it means to be a parent and what it means to take on that kind of role, especially if you yourself have grown up with like a sort of complicated relationship with your own parents, and how do you sort of learn from those experiences and not necessarily create the same difficult or in some cases like abusive dynamics with your kids, or the kids in your life if you're not if you're like a parent figure but not necessarily a parent. So yeah, I think there's a lot of recurrences of that across the collection. I didn't even realize how many stories there were about pregnancy specifically
Hmm.
until someone pointed it out to me. They were like, "Oh, there's like a lot of like
Hmm.
babies and like motherhood," and I was like, "Oh, I had no idea." So maybe this is me kind of unconsciously working out like my own feelings about the possibility of motherhood. Um, but I think, yeah, parenthood is complicated because people are complicated. And so much of, I think, adulthood for me anyway has been about uh coming to understand sort of like my childhood and like the role that my parents played in it, learning to forgive them for certain things that have happened, and also just for things that I don't know if I'm ready to forgive, just sort of like at least trying to understand where they came from,
Yeah.
and seeing them too as people who are children, were children, and maybe have their own kind of complex histories with their parents that they don't know how to talk about. Because, the whole idea of even talking about your childhood is sort of this like very recent phenomenon. Like for my
Mhm.
parents' generation, it was, you just listened to your parents and that was it.
Exactly. It's a great point. There's a beautiful excerpt, again, talking about contradictions, and it's okay to forgive. I'm oversimplifying, but maybe in this in particular case, it's okay to forgive, but you're not going to forget. Or, just this idea that you can see her or him as awesome, great, but also flawed. The excerpt is, quote, "That sun-streaked morning you tell yourself two things. Someday you will forgive your father, and you will remember his occasional tenderness and be able to hold it alongside the hurt he caused you and your family, and see it all like light through a prism, refracted by both the things you cannot look at and the things you cannot look away from." Joyce and the Dead, come on. We got oh my gosh, occasional tenderness, right? I love how it's occasional. It's not just tenderness. That even says something different, this idea of the prism and refracted by both the things you cannot look at and the things you cannot look away from. Just on a craft basis, it's beautifully written. But yeah, just someday you will forgive him. Not
Mm,
today, not today, but someday you will. So beautifully written there. That again, I'm pretty sure is from the last story of the collection, right?
yeah.
you talked about going through things, and there's so many moments. That moment at the end of the arrow where, or excuse me, the end of the one, just ideas of relaxing, the end of the first story, right? Relaxing, letting things regenerate. There's so much about living in the moment and, what can we do besides live in this moment? In the arrow, the line is, quote, "There's only this moment and the next, and the only thing to do in the meantime is to keep on living." There is so much in this book, in this collection, that is just beautifully written on a sentence by sentence basis. There's so much about themes we've talked about, and I hope I'm not oversimplifying the themes. I know you didn't necessarily maybe, start out saying I'm going to touch on this theme, but there's so much intersectionality or intersection between these. What I've kind of talked about, kind of what I think. What again, having written these stories at so many different times. I mean, would you say this over a span of 4 years, 8 years, from like first one to last one?
I think that sounds right. Yeah, I think somewhere along the lines of like, I usually say like around 4 years because I
Mhm.
think maybe some of the oldest stories were started back in like 2019-ish. But then there are
Yeah.
other stories where I look back and I'm like, oh, I actually started that back in like, I don't
Yeah.
know, 2016, 2017. And then I kind of abandoned it and then came back to it because that's
Mhm.
kind of how writing is a lot of times. You start something and, sometimes you need to let it marinate and you need to
Sure.
like live whatever it is that you want to write or put into the story. So I would say, estimating it's probably something like, yeah, 5 to 7 years across like all of the stories from their first beginnings to
Mm.
the version that lives on now in the book.
Right. Right. It's not necessarily the same thing as themes. I wonder, I mean, we talked about a lot, but I wonder if, what you see as any through lines, especially when, maybe people called it to your attention. You didn't necessarily see it, maybe it's subconscious, but just some through lines of ideas, of characters, of points you're trying to get across.
Yeah, I would definitely say like this was another thing that I didn't realize was like an enduring preoccupation of mine in my writing until someone pointed out to me. But I think animals and it's sort of an interest
Yes.
in the relationship that we have to animals and the natural world is something that kind of always crops up across my writing. And it's
Mm.
something I explored much more explicitly in my novel that came out last year as well. But I think the reason I come back to that is just thinking about like, it's so much more interesting to contemplate what the world looks like when you're not just limiting it to what a human might think, where I
Mm.
mean, I of course cannot know what an actual praying mantis would think of their day-to-day situation, but we can imagine, right? And there are so many ways in which like the things that we take for granted as humans would not be the same for an animal from their POV or for like a magical supernatural creature that's sort of a
Mm.
hybridized animal human in the way of the fox demons in the story collection as well, and the short story Human Hearts. So I'm always interested in like, how can a given situation, complicated parent-child relationship or a difficult romantic relationship, how can those sorts of things change if one or both parties in the equation are, not who we expect them to be, whether it's like one of them might be a robot, one of them might be an animal, one of them might be an immortal being with like
Mm.
different kinds of choices and different conceptions of time. And, in fiction, because we can make things up and sort of follow a character to a given trajectory, which is what we call plot. I feel like that's sort of like my kind of playing field for sort of imagining and mapping out what those things could look like.
Mm.
I think another enduring sort of preoccupation or theme of mine is this idea of like transformation or change. Like there are some stories in the collection where transformation is much more explicit, where it's like a character
Literal.
is, yeah, very
Mm.
literal. A character is becoming something or going through some sort of like magical or alchemical process to change their body in a physical way. But I think all of the stories involve change that's also internal in some way, which I mean, from a craft perspective, a lot of the time when we study stories, we are often told that there has to be some kind of change that happens, right? I don't think that's always true. Like, not every story or book needs to have a character that changes drastically, but you know, plot is often like, you can map it in any shape you want, but usually when you end a story, we want to, as readers, see the character in a different place than where they started. And so for me, I'm always thinking about like, okay, what would that change look like internally and externally? And how does that change make sense for where they want to go next? And I mentioned this earlier in our conversation, but for me, the most profound changes are not often these like big things where you're like, yes, now I'm gonna like break up with like my bad partner and like become this whole new person who wakes up every morning at 6 and goes, most of the time change doesn't happen that way. Change
Mm.
happens in small
Incrementally, yeah.
incremental ways, exactly, where you might just wake up and think, oh, I'm not going to call that person today. And then you might not. And then your whole life might change as a result of it in
Mm.
small little ways. I'm always sort of interested in like those moments too in my fiction and writing about characters sort of facing those kinds of junctures.
Well, there definitely was no sophomore slump. The This collection is so interesting. You mentioned the hybrid like fox. Would it be pronounced Kumaho?
Kumiho.
Kumiho
Mhm.
would be one that just stands out on its own in that it's so different in some ways, but of course it does have a lot about transformation and ideas of animals and their sentient being as sentient beings kind of thing. But that story is just like, whoa, so cool, but also so interesting and also so moving, over something that's mythical. So yeah, there's definitely a lot about animals, and I'm glad you mentioned that. Congratulations on the collection. Like I said, hopefully people will be listening to this after March 12th. So it's like, what are you doing? Go get the book, buy it online, buy it on Bookshop, buy it anywhere you can buy books. Just want to thank you so much for your for letting us know some of the background and really filling us in on this incredible collection.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this was so fun. Thank you for having me.
It's great talking to you. Thank you.